Well, I guess we're almost ready because it's that time. And as the master of ceremonies for these events, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. And I just told him I'd be very careful. I will not step on any papers. So, with that being said, our topic for tonight is the history of the Agnes disaster, the flood of '72, which I was a young boy just out of high school, and I remember it very well. Went down there and seen all the buildings and seen the flood waters up 3 stories high and sometimes even higher. And I just was amazed at how high that water was and where it was and how long it took for it to recede and how much damage was done. And we had a small little flood here in Jermyn, which wasn't small to some of us, but in comparison to the Agnes flood, it was like a trickle of water out of your faucet, you know, compared to what the Agnes flood was. And we've had some pretty close calls since then. I think 2004 and 2006, we've had some high water in the Susquehanna that went up to 40-some feet with the new dikes that were there, and if they weren't there, they would have been flooded again. But the Agnes flood caused them to increase the dikes and dams and levees and everything around that Wilkes-Barre area so that there would be no future flooding. And I have pictures of me standing there with my finger in the dike down at the bridge that goes across the river by the courthouse there.
Yeah.
I was down there, and when I was county commissioner, we took our guys down to help them during the flood, and the water was coming through. It was up. I could stand on the wall and reach down and touch the water, and that's 48 feet. And I was down alongside the thing with my finger in the dike, and somebody took a picture of me trying to hold the water back. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce a good friend of mine, softball player extraordinaire, TV newscaster extraordinaire, historian extraordinaire, Mr. Dave Decosmo.
Thank you. I just realized as I was getting ready to speak this evening that there are 3 historical events to which I have a direct tie. And one is the sinking of the Titanic. I spoke on that here back in April. And the other is the Mary Jo Kopechne incident with Senator Ted Kennedy losing her life. And, you know, and of course, Agnes. So everything seems to be linked with water. So that's a little disconcerting. I also feel it's very ironic and how appropriate in a sense that I'm here on 9/11, the 21st anniversary of probably the worst man-made disaster that has ever hit this country. And Tropical Storm Agnes was at the time the worst natural disaster to hit the United States, according to then President Richard Nixon. And how times have changed. And is it proof or evidence of climate change? If you Google the worst natural disasters to hit the United States, you will now not find Agnes in the top 10. I don't believe you'll find it in the top 20, perhaps even below that. And most of them have been since 2000. There have been a few before. Katrina, by the way, was the worst to hit. Before I sort of start recounting Agnes, I want to point out all of these displays that were brought here by Cody Gonzalez from Childs. Cody, you're to be commended for, first of all, being that interested in history, but more than that, preserving what you've been able to preserve of the history of Agnes. I made a couple of these books. I didn't print them. I mean, I'm in them. And for what it's worth, there's been several documentaries made on the Agnes flood. This is probably the best. One is on Channel 44, but I'm going to say this is a little better. This concentrates on Wyoming Valley. And they are re-showing this at the Kirby this coming Saturday, the 17th, which, by the way, is also my birthday. So if you want to come down and see that, it's really something to see on the big screen. One of the producers is Alan Stout, who is the head of the Visitors Bureau in Luzerne County, who shares my interest in Agnes and my birthday, September 17th. So I think there's only one showing, 7 o'clock that evening, but it's well worth your while to see it on the big screen. When I look back at Agnes, we have to actually go before June 23rd of 1972, because we had an extremely wet summer, and that complicated things tremendously because our ground was totally saturated well before Hurricane Agnes formed and came up the East Coast. Agnes did a lot of damage from Florida right on up to New York State, but about halfway up the coast it started to veer off, and everyone thought that it was going to produce some rain here, but not much more than that. Unfortunately, there was an unusual convergence of weather systems that forced Agnes to double back over northeastern Pennsylvania and southern New York, and then a front coming in from the west that stalled it. So it was downgraded to a tropical storm before it hit us, but it was nonetheless, it was still tremendously damaging. You would think a tropical storm is not as bad as a hurricane. Well, in some respects that's true, but in the case of Agnes, that's not the case because the water kept coming down on ground that would not hold that water. My involvement, which became extreme, was yet accidental in one sense. I was the news director of WILK Radio, and I was working part-time for Channel 16 at that time. WILK was what we call the Conelrad station at the time. We were the emergency station. If something happened, we were to broadcast emergency information. And as such, we had a two-way radio at the Luzerne County Courthouse. My thought as the news director of WILK was, rather than constantly call civil defense to say what's happening, or I've heard this, what can you tell me? Rather than doing that and interrupting them, why not go over to civil defense, be there, hear what's going on, and send the information back on our two-way radio system? Well, civil defense had an awful lot of volunteers, and they were turning out because we knew there was a threat of a flood. We knew the situation was dire, but not imminent, not at the moment. And one of the people who did not show up as a volunteer to civil defense was the public information officer. And Frank Townden, who was the civilian director of civil defense, drafted me, literally drafted me. David, I need a public information officer. Please, will you do it? And I called my boss at WILK Radio and explained the situation, and he said, well, you're going to be broadcasting information to us anyway, so go ahead, take the position. And as such, I was able to be the one to take the information from what was happening and disseminate it. But we were one radio station, and perhaps you didn't listen to WILK. A young man from WAZL in Hazleton, Ron Giulianardo, his radio name was Ron J. Ron was one of three people who I must say was responsible for getting me into broadcasting. I was an errand boy at WAZL when I first started in 1959, and the program director came to me and said, we think you ought to be an engineer. Would you like to study engineering? I said, really, I have no interest in engineering. I want to do on-the-air work. He said, well, you'll never make it in broadcasting. So I was destroyed. And Bill Schmier, a DJ at WAZL, and Ron J. basically came and counseled me and said, Dave, don't even listen. You're doing fine. Keep doing what you're doing. Everything will be fine. I thank them to this day for giving me that boost of confidence. And there was others along the way too. I've really tried to help others younger than myself as I've been, of course they're all younger than myself now, but I've tried to lend a hand to them. So Ron called with an idea. And Ron said, David, if you will give us permission, we will take your signal from WILK, we'll rebroadcast it on WAZO. Well, that would automatically, quadruple our audience toward the south. And I thought, what a great idea, and it's all flood information or dangerous information, if you will. Why don't I try some others? So I started to call, and I wound up running a network of 13 area radio stations, all broadcasting flood information. We had a regular newscast at 1:15 every hour, but in the meantime, they could take all the information that was coming at any time and use it on their own station. This was very important for a couple different reasons, but the one fits into today's headlines because you've all heard of fake news. Well, very frankly, to me as an ethical broadcaster, fake news is something that you hear that you don't agree with. Not that I'm giving you bad information, but you don't agree with the information I'm presenting to you, therefore it's suddenly fake news. During Agnes, we had a radio station in the Wyoming Valley that got a call from someone, and I believe it was in the community of Plymouth. And what happened there was you had a situation where there were strong winds, the water was high, and you had waves coming over the top of the levee system. And this person, well-meaning, calls this particular radio station to say, the dike's broken, the water's coming over. Well, if you heard that and you lived right in that area, you were panicking, and it wasn't accurate. Now, Plymouth was the first community evacuated, but that was coincidental and not tied in a timeline with that report. So, Civil Defense was concerned about misinformation getting out. And they felt that if we had this combined effort of broadcasters, certainly once an hour, if not throughout an hour, broadcasting verified information, that you could turn to those stations and feel confident, that you were getting the truth that you could count on. And that proved to be very, very key. We could deal with the rumor mill, if you will. Now, it also came to be very important because we felt for a time, and I say we, I'm speaking of Civil Defense, and remember I shared the information. I didn't make the decisions. I might have made suggestions for how to get the word out, but I didn't make the decisions. There was a real feeling that there was a chance to beat the flood. The levee system that we had at the time was at a certain height, and all the math showed us that the water was going to be slightly higher than that. And so I was told to put out a broadcast on this network asking for volunteers to man sandbags, specifically 10,000 volunteers. And you know what? We had them. We got 10,000 people. A lot of them were college students. And a lot were working people whose employer sent them out as volunteers. And it's interesting today, as I look back, and I talk to some of the folks who are still around, to hear how the flood, before all the terrible damage that it caused, temporarily at least bridged a generation gap. Here's the kids, here's these wild kids. Hey, they're not so bad. They're out here with us and they're lifting the sandbags and filling the sandbags. And conversely, hey, there's those old timers, they could be sitting at home They're here manning the sandbag. They all work together. Togetherness was a key to dealing with this flood, from the threat to the flood to the recovery. People working together. It's something that ought to be remembered for future emergencies, whatever the nature of those emergencies. Now, what happened was we got the volunteers and they're manning the sandbags. A couple areas, like the community of Plymouth, were evacuated. You know, you had floodwaters all throughout this area, here and there. Not the river, but streams were causing tremendous damage. Backup water, places where the drains could not handle the water. So it wasn't isolated to Wyoming Valley and the city of Wilkes-Barre, but let me say this. Of the Tropical Storm Agnes flood, Wilkes-Barre, Wyoming Valley, Wilkes-Barre was the Hiroshima. We were ground zero. Agnes, from Florida to New York State, caused 122 deaths that we know of, and $3 billion in damage. That's 1972 dollars. 2/3 of that damage was in Luzerne County, and most of it was in Wyoming Valley. $1 billion worth in Wyoming Valley. When we got a report on the 23rd from the community of Towanda, we got the word as to where the river was there. Now, the river is like a math problem. If you know the height of the river in a given community, you know you can calculate what that height will be in a downstream community X amount of time later. And our river observer, Nick Suchak, who was the actual employee rather than a volunteer for civil defense, got the word from Towanda on the 23rd of June and came into our little headquarters and said, we can't beat it. The reading there, there's no way we can raise the levees that much. And I was told by General Townend that I was to give the evacuation order as soon as the siren sounded. They wanted to do the siren first before they announced anything, because we wanted to get those sandbaggers away from the river. One of the books, I'm not sure if you have it here, I'll have to look over them, written by Dr. Tony Massari. He's since passed. And Tony did a wonderful job in writing, but he had one thing in there that I totally disagreed with. His feeling was that about the time we evacuated Plymouth on the evening of the 22nd, that we should have evacuated everybody. Well, a couple of complications there. Number one, we still felt we might beat the river. We might be able to keep up with it. So there was a fighting chance. Number two, if you had to evacuate everybody else, it was going to be at night. Absolutely the worst time to have people getting out. Way too dangerous, unless you came to where you just had no choice. But we knew we had some time to work with. So I went out, I'll never forget it, because I had a call from ABC Radio. They wanted me to do a live report. And I went outside the courthouse and I was giving the report that we were going to have to evacuate when the siren sounded. So if they have that soundbite at ABC yet, it's pretty dramatic. And it's ironic, I still do a daily blog, a video blog on Facebook. And I consider that as part of the media, and consequently I'm now 63 years into the media. And in 63 years in broadcasting, I am remembered most for the words, get out now. There's still time, but you've got to leave. It's time to get out. And if you see any of the video presentations, including the one at the Kirby on Saturday, or the one done by WVIA, you will hear a siren and you'll hear my voice saying it out. Now, my voice was coming from this particular body at the time. Obviously, photography has downgraded my appearance, because, yeah, that's me. It's exactly the same. Well, maybe not. If I wouldn't have used that hair dye back then, you wouldn't. Oh, I didn't have a mustache then either. Let's hide this one. One of the most dramatic things, other than hearing that siren, was standing outside the courthouse in the same spot where I gave that news broadcast about evacuation, and hearing crack, crack, crack. I mean, the river was very loud, but I heard crack, 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 and that was the sound of the North or Pierce Street Bridge breaking apart right in front of me. The water, there are two bridges, two main bridges right by the Luzerne County Courthouse. If you're looking at the courthouse, the one to the right, which has now been rebuilt and called the Veterans Memorial Bridge. If you lived in Wilkes-Barre, it was the North Street Bridge. If you lived in Kingston, it was the Pierce Street Bridge, because those were the two streets that converged at that spot. And I saw the thing break apart. So the siren sounding, the bridge breaking apart, definitely two of the most astounding things, but there was at least one other yet to come. You keep hearing me use the term civil defense. Now, today we have the Emergency Management Agency. We have the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, and we have the National Federal Emergency Management Agency. Then everything was civil defense. And civil defense was primarily set up because of the Cold War. Because of the fear, we're coming out of World War II, now Russia is our enemy. Now they have atomic weapons, can something happen? We have to be ready for this. And so the Luzerne County Office of Civil Defense was set up in, and I stress the word, sub-basement of the Luzerne County Courthouse. Most people know there's a basement in the county courthouse. A lot don't know there's a sub-basement. So that. Now, if you are worried about radiation coming and a bomb hitting, you're pretty darn good if you're down there. If you're worried about water coming up, that's not quite the same equation. So I'm doing a broadcast, and there's a drain in the floor, and you know those fountains you have in public square, different places? And of course it occurred to me that this was not a decorative thing. This was water coming in. And I went over and told General Townend, hey, there's water coming into this office, so we're going to have to evacuate the courthouse. We're going to have to move the civil defense headquarters. And the late Ethel Price, one of our county commissioners, we're starting to move what we can out. She says, Dave, will you help me take some of these boxes? There was some records stored down there, a lot of records, but I helped her carry some of this. She was no 30-year-old at the time, and she's carrying some boxes. I carried some up. Found out later that some of those records were signed by Ben Franklin, who was the state treasurer of Pennsylvania for a time. And these legal documents, so she knew that, and she thought, we got to get these upstairs. Well, of course, now you hit some of the technical difficulties. You got to move. My radio station, WILK, was going to go off the air. Its transmitters were all on low ground. So we checked around, and WYZZ radio, some of the callers, most of them are gone now, was an FM station on high ground in Wilkes-Barre. And they said, we will become your flagship station. And that's fine. Now we have a station to get the information out. But we have to get the information from civil defense to WYZZ, hence to the other stations. These didn't exist. We didn't have these things. We may have been better off. So the telephones were all out in Wilkes-Barre. We had no telephone service in Wyoming Valley. One of the last calls I made was home to tell my wife I'd be home a little bit late. I came home for a little bit, 3.5 days later. But she knew where I was, because she could hear me. So we had to get the information from Civil Defense, which moved to the Wilkes-Barre School District Administration Building. And the WYZZ radio was probably, I'm going to say, 1.5 miles from there. We had an Army field telephone. if you've ever seen MASH or some of those, they pick up the phone, they turn the crank, and that gets the power into the line. We were broadcasting information from that to the radio station then sending out the signal that the other stations were picking up. We only lost one broadcast, one of our hourly broadcasts. 2 kids found the wire in the street and played jump rope. and they broke the wire. And that was the only one that we lost. We then had security all around us. And by that time, of course, people are out. We're now broadcasting public direct information that technically is not allowed by the FCC. In other words, Joe Smith is safe over here in the back mountain area. He was separated from his family. They didn't know where he was. He couldn't call. The phones weren't working. So we would do that. We would broadcast a certain amount of personal information to get people to know that they were safe. Another thing that the network was able to accomplish was the evacuation going out simultaneously to everybody to get them to leave. And although we were the Hiroshima of Agnes, in Wyoming Valley, as far as we know, we lost 3 lives. It's a possibility that 5 may have been lost, but we know positively of 3. And 2 of those were rescue workers. One was one that couldn't get away from the dike fast enough, got caught up in something, which is another lesson I offer to people. All the time when you have an emergency that really looks severe, hurricane, tornado, you'll get an evacuation notice in certain areas. And I plead with you, if you're in one of those areas and you get a notice, please go. Because if you don't go, you may be perfectly safe, but you may be stranded and you may put other lives at risk trying to come and get you out. And that's what happened in 2 cases during Agnes. And you see it all the time. You see it in almost every emergency. They're bringing helicopters in, they're bringing boats out. They don't all make it all the time. Some of them have problems. The other thing I tell people, and it's a lot easier today with today's technology, the one lament I heard after Agnes constantly, people who had lost their house, and we're now rebuilding that house, were saying, oh my God, my wedding pictures are gone. My pictures of mom and dad are gone. My pictures of my grandma and my grandpa are gone. Well, nowadays you can put all your photos on computers. You can put them on one of those thumb drives. You can put them on so-called the cloud. I urge you to do that because it's something that is irreplaceable. Lives are irreplaceable, and memories, physical memories, are irreplaceable if they're lost in a disaster like that. All kinds of things were lost in that disaster, including at the 44th Cemetery, 3,000 bodies. Cemetery is located right on a curve, on a bend in the Susquehanna. The water came over, straight down and pushed up, and 3,000 bodies were disinterred. Some of them found, by the 44th airport, all over the place. They were able to recover a lot of bodies. They're only able to identify 30 of them, I believe. And what they've done is at the 44th Cemetery, where this horrible thing happened, there's a little monument there. And then in another cemetery up by the Francis Slocum State Park, there's another monument. That monument is at the spot where the remains were buried.
In this year book, they did about 3 chapters on that.
3 chapters on the okay, this is Hurricane Ags and when Cody, can they look at this when we're done? These are worth. This is such a treasure. Yep, here's some of the cemeteries. Outside you can see it from there. So please take a look at this later. And I mean, talk about a horrible sight. Now we were also told by General Townend, 2-3 days into this now. Basically, there's what amounts to martial law. Here's some more, though. This paper has some great stuff.
All
And why don't you leave that one open, because they'll want to see that. There was a situation where our network was able to help people in terms of where to relocate. I mean, some people went with families, but relocation centers had to be set up kind of on the spur of the moment, and some people had to stay in those for a while. We had things going for us too, though. We had a flood going for us, not Agnes, Dan. Congressman Dan Flood. And Congressman Dan Flood was head of the Military Appropriations Committee. And when Congressman Flood said, we need helicopters, believe me, we got helicopters. And Dan Flood was one of the strongest things that we had going for us in terms of beginning to recover. But before we got to that segment, General Town said, when people come back in, it's going to be so severe what they see, they could have heart attacks. He said, I'm going to send the news media in. We went on Deuce and a Half, the big army trucks with, 12 wheels or how many they have. And we made a tour. And he said, when you come back, TV will obviously show what they can show, but radio, paint a word picture of what people can expect so that they have some warning as to what they're going to come across. And they're a little prepared anyway. I mean, obviously you can't prepare somebody totally when they come back and their house isn't there, or it's filled with mud and everything else. But at least they knew they were going to go back to a place that would likely be filled with mud. So they knew they were going to have to work on that. And as I say, people started to help each other. Two main people that helped out overall in terms of getting money, in terms of getting equipment, were Dan Flood and the gentleman that you see in the center of this picture. His name was Frank Carlucci. Now Frank was a government worker, a career government man. At one time was the assistant director of the Central Intelligence Agency, head of the Office of Management and Budget, and he was from Wyoming Valley. President Nixon appointed him as his personal representative. When there was anything was desperately needed and Carlucci got the word, it went right to the president. And we could get action pretty quickly. And to his credit, by the way, the handsome young man, you only see half of that picture with the hair, that's me. But again, the picture doesn't do me justice. He had an open door policy. I mean, I could go in there at any time. I couldn't interrupt him if he was talking with somebody, obviously. But I could go in there and say, hey, I've heard this is happening. Get the answer for me. If he didn't have it, he'd get it for me. And he was that way with everyone in the media, because as the comeback started, of course, the network eventually faded away, and it was individual stations going after all of their information that they wanted. But those two guys were just so important. Before people got back in, and we were up there at this school district administration building broadcasting information, representatives of all of those 13 radio stations, mainly news people, would take a shift. Now, one of them was a friend of mine from WNAK radio that you don't know from WNAK, you know him from TV, is Mike Stevens. I actually was indirectly responsible for getting Mike into television. I was doing part-time work with Channel 22, and I got an offer right before Agnes to do the same part-time job with Channel 16. And I took it, and I gave Channel 22 6 weeks notice. Who gives 6 weeks notice? I gave 6 weeks notice, and the day before that ended, the boss called down and said, you know anybody else who would like to do that job? I said, I have a friend at WNAK I think would be good, and that was Mike, and Mike got in. So Mike comes to do a shift on the emergency network, and we have armed National Guardsmen around that area. This is virtually martial law during those first couple of days. He stops Mike. You can't go in there. And Mike is saying, I have a shift to do on the radio. Well, I don't know that the guardsmen knew we even had the network or anything else, but they had a bit of a confrontation that ended with Mike walking past him and into the building and saying, if you have to shoot me, shoot. So Mike did his shift, and obviously you can tell that he was not mortally wounded. But those are the kind of small stories that may come back to you now, and that some humor comes out of what happened. But the working together, not only the neighbor helping neighbor situation. You know that I don't have exact figures, but I will tell you from the bottom of my heart that I believe that some 95 to 97% of the people forced out by Agnes came back to the very areas where they had been. Some located in Mountaintop, some in Dallas. Mountaintop saw an influx in people coming in. But most people came back. And they were able to do that partially because of all the help that they got. Mayor, you did a piece just a couple of weeks ago on bottles.
Yeah.
Here's one for you. You ever see this one? This is from Anheuser-Busch. This is Bud. It's not beer, it's water, drinking water. Anheuser-Busch put their plant to work. These are very rare. A man from FEMA came up with one and gave it to me as a present after I helped them with the FEMA online presentation on Agnes. But they had these because water was totally undependable. As a matter of fact, some of you may remember Bob Carroll from Channel 16. Bob was the news director of Channel 16, but he was also a National Guardsman. He was an officer, and he got into some polluted water and got very, very ill. And I got called in by the owner of Channel 16 at the time, Tom Shelburne, because remember, I was working part-time for him. He said, Dave, Bob's sick. Your station's off the air. I need a news director. Can you take the job? And I came to Channel 16 for a day, and I sat and watched everything for a day. And I came to him that evening, and I said, Mr. Shelburne, everybody in this building, including the janitor, knows more about television than I do. Because I was a radio man back then. So I said, thanks very much, but no thanks. My boss is going to come back on the air. He's going to need me. So I had my one day of fame as the news director of Channel 16. Some people say, Dave, you made a mistake. But I was happy with that decision. Again, most people did come back. First of all, after they got their homes cleaned up, and that was not come in today, move back in tonight. They had to have temporary housing. The Department of Housing and Urban Development brought in thousands of mobile homes. They didn't have enough manufactured in Pennsylvania. They had to go get some from down south where they were more popular. Of course, they weren't designed for our weather. So that was a bit of a problem. And the head of HUD at the time was George Romney. And he came in basically to tell the media and the people what a great job they were doing. And he did that at a meeting at which in the audience was a lady from the International Ladies Garment Workers Union named Min Matheson. Min didn't take anything from anybody. And she interrupted that news conference and basically said, you're doing a great job for us. And then she went into a tirade that had all the cameras turning to her. And by gosh, we got a lot more mobile homes and other action right after that. Purely coincidentally, I'm sure. But again, that was the kind of thing, the activism that we had. But most things were happening the right way. There were problems here and there. You can't get away from it. A good friend of mine, Fred Nye, was a reporter with a newspaper that no longer exists, the Sunday Independent. And his home was one of those actually taken away by the flood. There was no structure there that could be rebuilt or dug out. It was just washed away. We had a number of them like that. I tell people something that I mean, I hesitate to say it in a way, and yet I feel it's my responsibility to say it. Because I'm asked, can it happen again? And I have two answers. I said, yes, it can happen again. And in my opinion, it probably will. Now, maybe not exactly the same, and maybe not exactly in the same spot. But the mayor made reference to the fact that our levees were raised, And when they were raised, the next time we had high water, Wilkes-Barre and Kingston on the other side, those communities were spared. But West Pittston got hit for the first time. Because the water has to go somewhere. And if you stop it from going here, it's going to go there or there. Shikshini, if you live down there along the river, there's no hope. They haven't got enough people to warrant a flood protection wall. They took down an old bridge there, and the mayor started to put the concrete from the bridge along the river. The State Department of Environmental Protection said you can't do that. So his attempt was aborted. But the fact of the matter is that when you do adjust the levee system somewhere, it floods somewhere else. If any of you have ever been to Sunbury, you'll see a fantastic flood wall. During Agnes, the water was literally to the very top of that wall. If Wilkes-Barre had not flooded, Sunbury would have. So there's a cause and effect here, and you can't build a wall. Let me rephrase that. You can build a wall on both sides of the Susquehanna for its entire length. But the fact of the matter is, if that wall along both sides for the entire length is 18 feet high, Mother Nature could send you water that's 18 feet and 1/4 inch. Because Mother Nature doesn't follow the rules. The 100-year flood is not a 100-year flood anymore. Remember, I said you won't find Tropical Storm Agnes listed in the worst disasters now, because we've had so many others since. And again, most of them happened since the year 2000. Something's changing. Now you can debate why it's changing. You know, are we contributing to it? Yes or no, whatever your feelings may be. Is it just natural evolution? That may be as well. Perhaps it's a combination of both. But you've got to, it doesn't take a genius to realize things are changing. You just look at the number of disasters, what's happening, look at your weather around here now regularly. So whatever is causing it, if there's anything we can do to help mediate it, I would think that's worth doing. We learned a lot of lessons from Agnes, but there's some things we can't do, and the thing that worries me worst of all, 13 radio stations getting that information to you, they're gone. They're gone. They were all AM radio stations. Well, not all, but most were AM radio stations. WYZC was an FM station. It's gone. There are stations now that have replaced those. There's not as many. And many of those have on-the-air people who are not here. They're coming by satellite. They don't know James Street in Hazleton from Locust Street in Hazleton, or Broad Street in Wilkes-Barre from Broad Street in Pittston. So those stations are not there to get information. Now, if you're in a flood situation, perfect example, when you may have to leave, I'm sorry, but it's very difficult to carry a television set with you and try to watch it. Not to mention the fact that it's kind of rare for a station to just turn off all of the programming just devoted to that emergency. You do have these. And here's where they may come in handy, but I say may. You can get something like an Amber Alert on here. So that goes to everybody that signed up for an Amber Alert. So there's no reason you couldn't get information on this from your local emergency management agency. But how far will they go? Will they go far enough to tell you, like we did, that Joe Smith is safe over here? Or are they just going to give you, we have a shelter here and a shelter there, but will they go into the personal information? Can they do that? Will everybody be signed on to receive it? I hope so, because again, you're going to get that fake news, you're going to get that one report going to somebody that hears it, and if it's not verifiable from a legitimate source, how can you believe it? How can you trust it? You know, the anniversary of the George Banks mass murders is coming up on the 25th of this month. And I covered that story. And one of my best friends, Pat Ward, who was at that time the news director of WILK Radio, George Banks has just killed 13 people. He's wounded another. He's holed up in a house in Wilkes-Barre. 3 doors away, there's a young reporter with big sideburns leaning down behind the porch with his microphone hanging out, trying to get the guy, sound of the guy trying to talk him out. District attorney comes to Pat Ward and said, Pat, if you guys broadcast a false report and say that the kids are not dead, we think we can get them out. Now, Pat is friends with the DA. I was friends with the DA too. Pat even went to church with him and things. And the plea is, if you do this, we may save some lives. And so, I know I was on a program on WILK. I was just interviewed by one of the newspapers. You know, what did you think about that? I said, no way. I could not do that. Why? Very simply, if I tell you, if I lie on the air today, number one, I'm violating a federal law by doing that. But number two, tomorrow when I tell you that this school is in danger, can you believe me? Or am I doing that because the school director told me, Dave, if you say that, such and such will happen? A newsman has one thing, and one thing only, credibility. If you give up that credibility, you're lost. So, and again, Pat and I are very good friends, but to this day, you know, I say, Pat, I could not have done it. Now, again, Pat made an instant decision, right on the spot, and that's what happened. But instant decisions are sometimes dangerous in other ways. A county detective named Jim Zardecki had George Banks in his sights in that house with a high-powered rifle. Why didn't you shoot him? Jim said, Dave, scattered around there, including you behind that house, there's 15, 20 other people. If I just wounded him, or if I missed, he's opening up. And how many others are going to die? And of course, eventually they did talk him out. Ironically, the news report, the fake news report, had nothing to do with it. But that goes back to Agnes. The information that you're getting has to come from a credible source. And I used to argue with news directors all the time when they would say, a perfect example, we had a fire in Stroudsburg one time. And we're 20 minutes away from noon, we have our satellite truck set up, and I'm trying to find the fire chief. So what happened? How bad is it? Is it going to spread? Is anybody hurt in there? And I get back, I'm ready to do my report, and I'm getting the news director, the assistant news director saying, did you get interviews with any of the people around there? No. I'll do that for later in the day, but how about the facts? How about the people aren't going to have the facts? If I ever write a book on news, and it's getting pretty late in my experience to do that, it's going to be called, I Never Thought Anything Like That Could Happen in a Place Like This. Because it's the constant answer you get from everybody. And that's what some news directors want. They want public reaction. You know, well, it's good to get reaction in some cases, but shouldn't you get the facts that they should be reacting to first? Or the facts as they're known at that time anyway. And yeah, one of the facts I get may be wrong, but it's coming at least from an attributed source. So if there is another emergency, like a flood or a tornado or something, I would hope, and I've talked extensively with the people of the Federal Emergency Management Agency about trying to think about a system where you can localize your cell phone information distribution to get information accurately and quickly to people who can't depend on radio anymore. We had a tornado that hit a Wilkes-Barre shopping center. I guess it's about 3 years ago now. It hit right after it closed for the night. And foolish me, I heard somebody, probably was on the internet, hey, there was a tornado. And I go over and I turn on the radio and I'm tuning it down and I'm suddenly saying to myself, what am I doing? No one's got any news on at night. Now, Nancy Kamen from WILK was smart enough to come in and I wound up catching her along the line. But if you don't normally listen to news at night, are you going to look for it? You're going to know where to look for it? Now, when I was a news director at WILK and another FM station I had news people on 24 hours a day, maybe just one person that could get information. But you need credible information. Agnes proves it beyond doubt. And there will be future emergencies. I hope they don't hit you personally, but they might. And if they do, I hope you can be prepared thanks to credible people getting you that information. I've kind of got rid of all the water now, so I thank you very much for your attention. And I'll be glad to talk with anybody afterwards, or if you have any question I can answer, I'll try to answer it. But as I said during the Titanic presentation, if I don't know the answer, I'll make something up. I mean, I'll get the information for you.
Have any questions for him?
Yes.
How involved were the ham operators back then?
Oh, excellent. How involved were the ham operators? Because we didn't have telephone, ham radio operators, even citizen band radio operators, Army, radio communication, National Guard, police, even fire provided a lot of the data that we had to have. Once again, civil defense had to verify information, so it had to come from a credible source to them before we could get it out. So ham radio really saved the day to a great degree. So yes, sir.
In reference to like downtown Wilkes-Barre, I lived in Edwardsville at the time during the flood. And I used to go to Wilkes-Barre once a week, walk over there 2 miles from Edwardsville. I always felt that after the flood there was so much money flowing around and they had to spend it on something. And I think they gutted the heart of Wilkes-Barre by tearing down all those buildings on South Main, around the square. I mean, some of them were rat traps, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say some of them were about to fall down.
Yeah, they would have fallen on their own
before the
floor.
flood.
But it's like the heart of the city is.
Yeah, I think they just knew that you had a business district that was destroyed, and I think the general feeling was we have to start again. And ironically, you may remember this since you're from down there. They rebuilt the downtown, and one of the things they did was they put up canopies over the sidewalks on Main Street. And just a few years back, they all started to rot away, and they had to come down. There's no question they probably took down more than they had to, but that may be sort of like the COVID money. Suddenly there's so much COVID money available that people who are getting it, officials who are getting it, are kind of looking at how can we use this? And they may be rationalizing some of it as opposed to generally documenting precise use. But you have a good point. They probably took down more than they needed because here it comes, let's fix everything up. And, I mean, let's call a spade. Some of that money went to contractors that didn't do all that they were supposed to do. And I think there were a couple indictments based on that too. So, anybody else? I did get home eventually.
Lady over there.
You didn't say anything about the odor of that
Oh, the
odor.
odor.
I mean, that's the one of the things.
I
that
tried to forget that.
Yeah, that was.
The river had has a sulfur to it from the mines. The river water is now combined with sewage, with oil and gasoline from gasoline stations. So the odor that permeated the downtown lasted for weeks and weeks and weeks, and it was one of the things that people do most remember. I must say I wasn't exposed to that very much because I was pretty much in the headquarters except for taking that truck ride downtown until we got back in. Then the odor morphed into dust odor because odor. We once a lot of the cleaning was up. Some of the river type stench was gone, but there was a heavy dust in the area. Now I've got adult onset asthma, and I wouldn't doubt that some of that may be from my coverage of that and fires and things. I'm walking into smoke all the time and things. The odor was one of the things people remembered most. The mud and the odor. Everybody had mud in their basements if they were lucky enough to have a basement yet. A lot of them had fish.
Yep.
But that wasn't on the menu though.
Somebody here that did.
Oh.
In our flood, she had fish in her basement.
I had it in my parking lot.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for your attention. I appreciate it. Anything else?
I have a couple things to add.
Yes.
We just had a presentation at our Masonic Lodge from the Scott Township Dive Team, and they talked about the last flood up in Matamoras, up in Milford, Great Bend area. They rescued 38 people from up there with their dive team, with their boat. 70? Okay. They rescued people across the New York border and brought them into an area for people that were being evacuated, and they got yelled at by the government people from Pennsylvania that you're not supposed to bring those people from New York here. So they're trying to save people's lives.
Now you reminded me, I have to tell you, because you've got to know this. I didn't. I was on a show with Frank Andrews in WILK in June, and we had a caller, and I still don't know, the guy gave his first name, I don't know his last name. He was one of 2 people who were volunteer scuba divers. And they were called by a former mayor of Wilkes-Barre who was a funeral director, who had 2 bodies being prepared for burial that were in the basement of his funeral parlor that he wanted brought out. So the divers go down now there's no light except for their little light underwater. And one of them sees one of the bodies because the caskets are floating. And he tells, and when he tells us the one who called in, he said, "Here, there's a body right there. We'll get him." "No, you get him." "Well, I'm holding the light." "I'll hold the light for you." So they switch and he gets the body. And then the one that was afraid to get the body is kind of swimming around and he winds up finding the other one. So he's nuts about this. He's scared to death. They got them out. Then there was a report of a fire at the Hotel Sterling. Now, I'm just hearing this on the radio a couple months ago, and I said, there was no fire at the Sterling. I would have known about that. Well, this diver said they had heard that, and they were sent over there, and they couldn't swim over because of the current. So they had to go a back way swimming to get to the Hotel Sterling, where on the 3rd or 4th floor they found a mess of senior citizens who had candles all over the place, trying to have light, and I don't know if they were couldn't have been getting heat, and the smoke from those candles was what was coming out. The other diver who wouldn't get the body was Mark Chivarella. Do you remember Kids for Cash? John Chivarella? Yeah.
And one other thing, he talked about the trailers that they brought in. If you're going down 81 past the Blackman Street exit and you look to the right, you'll see the trailers are still there. That's where they put some of them.
That's Cooney Park, and the mayor of, late mayor of Ashley, Pat Cooney, turned it into a regular commercial mobile home park after.
And they're still there,
Agnes, yeah.
And if I was going to write a book, my book would be about bowling.
Oh.
And the title would be "The Lanes Are Flat, the Ball is Round, and the Pins Don't Move." What's so hard about it? So if there's any other questions, anybody have any questions for him? If not, our commercial break is we have our things for sale on the table that we always have at the Historical Society. There are refreshments here. Be careful if you examine any of these things here. Cody will be here standing by to make sure nothing gets damaged, but you can look at all of this stuff. And next month's lecture will be on the early history of the borough of Jermyn, the very beginning from the Indian times on. You'll see how far we get, because I would speak until we ended up with today's history. I keep right on going, but
Come down to the Kirby on Saturday and see the movie.
There you go. Go down to the Kirby. All right, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.